If there's one genre of games I adore above all others, it's detective games. They've been around for quite some time, plenty of old point-and-clicks technically able to be called detective games, but it's only been in more recent years that the little subgenre of puzzle games has begun to get widespread attention. And there's a couple of games that can be thanked for that. From the standout hits of Return of the Obra Dinn and Outer Wilds, which each showed how problem-solving and piecing together of a narrative can be done uniquely through an interactive medium, to smaller successes like Her Story and Paradise Killer, which add new layers and additions to the usual formula. And of course, there's the recent rise in popularity for both Danganronpa and Ace Attorney. The games I love most in this genre either tell fantastic stories, or do something only a game can do through letting the player solve their own mystery. But sadly, the former is usually what we get a lot more of, as despite my love for the genre, so many popular titles that claim to be detective games miss the entire point. These games usually throw out the element of actually needing to think and connect the dots yourself through simplistic mechanics that make it far easier for it to tell its linear narrative, rather than let the player actually feel like they're doing anything on their own. The best detective games manage to avoid this problem and do both, whether through more simplistic means like Ace Attorney by not holding your hand, or foregoing the linear structure entirely with cases like Obra Dinn. And the newest example of this perfect harmony of story and detective gameplay can be seen in a little title called The Case of the Golden Idol. The Case of the Golden Idol is a detective puzzle game released in 2022 on Steam, created by Color Grey Games, a studio of two Latvian brothers, Ernest and Andres. The two had been working in game development for 10 years before founding the studio, being inspired by mystery games that tapped into the medium like Obra Dinn or Her Story. The two sought to do something new with the formula and really let the player feel like a detective. The game was made to call back to old point-and-click adventure games the two loved, taking the rest of the inspiration from the 18th century and paintings of the era. The game sees you tracking several deaths and murders throughout the 18th century, following the titular Golden Idol as it trades hands and brings misfortune wherever it goes. You're tasked with figuring out the who, how, and why of each murder, all while piecing together a conspiracy that builds up through the entire game. It adds up to be an incredible game, both in terms of the wonderful story and drama it builds up to, and the brain-scratching joy of solving these cases. So today, I want to break down what makes this game so special in comparison to its peers. Now, with this being a mystery game, a spoiler warning should be obvious, as I will have to discuss a few examples at points, and the game is best experienced completely blind. I'll only use footage up to the 7th case of the game to not spoil the biggest twists, but other cases may have certain aspects or answers spoiled through the footage. So if this interests you at all, please try it out before coming back to this video. With all of that in order, let's dive into what makes Golden Idol so special. The first thing that will immediately catch most people's eyes with this game is the visual style, both with how it emulates the point-and-click adventure games of old, but also in just how unappealing it is. And that's a compliment to it. Case of the Golden Idol takes a very striking visual style, using incredible skill in pixel art to capture some of the most horrifying and ugly visages known to man. The game can be very visually pleasing when it wants to be, such as through its gorgeous backgrounds or the various items you can come across in the scenes. But when it comes to portraying the characters throughout the game, or the brutal deaths, the game doesn't hold back. It draws them all with the uncomfortable details you'd expect, with ugly wrinkles, facial features, and blemishes that make you disgusted with almost every character you meet throughout the game. And this is all completely intentional. The game is all about showing these folks for the disgusting freaks they can be and the uncensored gruesomeness of what they'll do. So it just makes that obvious, rather than hiding behind pretty faces and outward appearances. But it also excels with the former thing I said catches people's eyes, with how it nails the overall look and feel of a point-and-click adventure from back in the day. The UI is done perfectly, from how the menus look and feel, to the font itself, to the limited colors the game goes for. It holds itself to the limitations of the time, and aside from extra detail in some places to build its atmosphere, all the pixel art within the game feels like it wouldn't be out of place at all in something like Monkey Island. The artist clearly took a long time studying those games and have so much passion for them with how close they got to matching them perfectly. But the true standout when it comes to the game's presentation, what helps set the mood more than anything else, is the incredible soundtrack composed by Kyle Misko, a small Ukrainian composer with a lot of small projects under their belt. And goodness do I wish they were less small, because the work they did here is something else. Not only is it just excellently composed orchestral music, but it works hand in hand with the game's story to elevate every scene perfectly. And it's incredibly varied in what it can do, with some tracks giving a sense of pure dread and foreboding over what's being shown to you, some giving a panicked air to a frantic scene of death and destruction, and some creating complex mixes of emotions as you unravel the complicated events of the story. There are some standout tracks that really manage to both just sound incredible and tell the story of their scene through the music alone, such as with Intoxicating Dinner and Crowning Celebration. These two, and really most of the soundtrack, are songs I just can't get out of my head. They aren't just simple background noise to help you in solving the case. They serve a critical role in telling the story of these murders. But speaking of those murders, how about we discuss the incredible investigative gameplay of Case of the Golden Idol? As said before, there's been two approaches in how to handle a mystery in terms of mechanics and story. The first is the more common approach, sacrificing mechanics that involve true deduction at your own pace, instead offering a more guiding hand, with questions and prompts to lead the linear story along in the exact directions the creators want, step by step. This is the approach employed by games like LA Noire, Danganronpa, and Ace Attorney. But the second approach is one we've seen crop up more recently, where the idea of a more linear progression and pacing to how one solves the murder and thus goes through the story is thrown out the window in favor of leaving the player with the clues, their mind, and the task of deducing the entire case with just their wit. This was a standard popularized by Return of the Obra Dinn, though others have done the same, such as with Outer Wilds and Her Story. Golden Idol very clearly follows in the footsteps of this second approach, Obra Dinn in specific, and it basically admits that. Much like Obra Dinn, the chapters of the Case of the Golden Idol see you left with a scene frozen in time, repeating the few same seconds on loop, with you playing an omnipotent observer as you poke around the scene, see the items people have on them, and try to piece together what's happening in the scene. Like Obra Dinn, it has a system that really requires the player to understand the scene and what's happening without them being able to brute force it. And Case of the Golden Idol takes a rather novel approach, making the solving screen almost a Mad Lib of the various words, names, and objects you pick up throughout the scene, leaving so much room for error that you have to do the deductions in order to stand a chance. While they may not be apparent at first, this system actually offers a lot of unique strengths over Return of the Obra Dinn. What it loses in sheer immersion and simplicity, it gains in being able to craft far more interesting mysteries and cases to solve. With the versatility of the word system, you no longer have to just piece together how a person died and their name, but also potentially their motives, any additional plots going on, the entire makeup of the scene before you, and plenty of other possible riddles that add a whole new dimension to solving these cases. And it uses that new potential to the fullest degree with the scenarios it manages to craft, each one offering something wholly new from the last. While the first few act as simple tutorials you would expect from most mystery games, it quickly takes off the gloves and goes all in with giving incredibly complex scenarios to parse, the methods and motives growing increasingly more convoluted and fun to piece together as it goes along. But murder isn't the only trick Golden Idol has, as each case throws on additional layers of complexity when it comes to unlocking the truth, that not only make the cases more fun to solve, but also make each and every one incredibly memorable. Whether you're sorting out a family tree, the workings of a mysterious cult, or even the titular Golden Idol, there's always a new angle to each murder that will challenge your brain in different ways. These end up being some of the best mysteries I've seen in detective games, with the perfect amount of red herrings and obfuscation without ever going into the worst of point-and-click logic. Everything lines up perfectly when you look back at a case, just as it should. And despite what I said about the game leaving the player to sink or swim, it actually has some surprisingly good mechanics to help guide players in the right direction without holding their hand. Along with the main scroll you have to fill in and the usual identities page, each scenario offers unique panels that tackle the extra elements of a case that I mentioned before, offering the player with a prompt to answer that question that is so key to the case. It ends up creating an excellent sense of progression as you toil away at these additional elements, which then put the information in front of you that let you crack the case wide open. Or at least not get stuck in your own assumptions like I did. Because on top of this, the word system is built to not allow for total brute forcing, but also let the player know when they're on the right track. As when you have it all right in a panel except for 2 words, it will let you know. This keeps you from making stupid mistakes with keeping one wrong word and running yourself in circles remaking the whole scroll because you missed it. Although, it's the one element I have a problem with in the system, as it does easily open the door for you to abuse it as confirmation of what's right and wrong and brute force your way to figuring out what's wrong. But then again, no mystery system that isn't just purely in your head can survive players wanting to brute force it. Overall, Case of the Golden Idol, while having its faults and very different appeals, definitely stands toe-to-toe with Obra Dinn in terms of making mysteries, and may even stand above it in its second half. But the most important part of any good mystery game is the story that slowly unravels and begins to be pieced together as the player cracks the case. So let's discuss the surprising and wild story that Golden Idol is here to tell. While I said Case of the Golden Idol fits more into the style of non-linear mystery games like Obra Dinn in its gameplay, that's not entirely true, as it very much deviates when it comes to how it tells its story. Despite being a mystery game of its individual moments and murders, Golden Idol doesn't have a story you piece together and solve. Rather, it's told to you chronologically with standard escalation of its narrative, with only a handful of missing pieces you discover later, like any good mystery story. I would go more in depth with the deeper implication of this and the differences between it and other games, but if you want that, the channel Video Games Are Bad has an excellent video on this topic and Golden Idol's differences with Obra Dinn, which is linked in the description. Although be warned, it has some major spoilers within. But what I'd like to discuss is what it gains and loses from this choice of structure compared to Return of the Obra Dinn. While it loses that deeper sense of mystery and that connection to the story that you get by seeing in your own order and having it be a unique experience, it gains in being able to create a narrative more finely weaved together that can make use of sudden twists in the narrative and absolutely bonkers escalation as it goes along. Because of this, Case of the Golden Isle is able to offer one of the most finely paced plots of intrigue and twists I've ever seen, with some of the most memorable characters and moments to boot. And although I do want to discuss that pacing and escalation, along with the story's themes and its later reveals, I can't really do any of it without spoiling a fair deal about the later twists of the game. So, for those who haven't played the game yet, skip to this timestamp to avoid spoilers. And because this section won't make much sense otherwise. The thing that really makes Case of the Golden Isle stand out story-wise is the utterly insane progression it has to its story. This first happens in the way you would expect, starting out as a small series of murders and accidents within a single family that could be written off as coincidences, before pulling back the curtain to reveal a grand conspiracy surrounding the Idol, the Brotherhood of Masks, and various characters you've met being in on it the whole time. This gives all the engagement of a usual mystery reveal, and honestly could be the place where other stories would end, having given us our central answer to something that's been bugging us the whole time with those rings. It would just need to answer the central questions around the Idol, and to wrap up the last few characters. But it doesn't do that. Instead, from this point on, the story goes into maximum overdrive and begins to spin out of control as things just escalate and escalate and escalate in directions you never would have expected when you first saw Albert push Oberon from that cliff. Whereas before you could usually follow the line and guess where the next case would take you pretty easily, now the game leaves you completely guessing. As one moment you're in a cult ceremony, the next it's a political game of Clue, and the next you're seeing the rise of an authoritarian dictator. It makes for a wildly entertaining ride, and also allows for these last few cases to go all out with interesting set pieces and wild murders to solve. And while the Brotherhood expertly pretends to be the game's big twist that makes everything before it makes sense, it hides another that makes everything hit so much harder. Because the final reveal of Edmund being Lazarus Hearst is one of the best I've seen in a mystery story. The way the game uses increased spectacle and scope to blind you to the elements of this that would otherwise be obviously suspicious, like Walter and David's conflicting reports, David suddenly working with Walter, Lazarus suddenly appearing, and that damn journal that makes it all so obvious in retrospect. It puts things into perspective in a way far greater than the Brotherhood ever did, with answering those questions I just asked, alongside the sudden appearance of the Order Party as the goal of the Brotherhood. And the game revealing Edmund to be the main puppeteer and central antagonist puts everything into perspective when it comes to the game's brilliant theming and message about the nature of humanity. Despite the story being one of conspiracies, cults, and grand plots, at its core, Case of the Golden Isle is a game about selfish human nature. No matter where you look throughout the game, everything that happens is because of humans being selfish fools with no sense of order. Every character throughout the game is usually driven by nothing but pure emotion, holding on to grudges or obsessions that drive them completely, whether it's Walter Keane and his strange vanity, or Alistair and his obsession with power and strength. The smaller characters such as the cook or the people playing cards. Emotional to a dangerous or pathetic degree is what they all are. The only ones who can say don't follow this are the Brotherhood and Edmund, the cunning masterminds behind the entire plot of the game, wishing to gain control over their world and finally make sense of it all. But, as of a cruel joke on them, everything that actually matters was driven by pure emotion and pathetic reasoning, whether it be Albert pushing Oberon and stealing the idol out of nothing but unfounded fears, or Peter getting drunk and ending the entire Order Party with one great blast. Even Edmund himself, a man seemingly driven by creating a society where emotion is outright banned, found his own end through selfish desire and breaking his own first virtue. In an age of order, it turns out that nature triumphs. Till the very end, even with a grand plot and all the magic in the world, Edmund cannot change what humanity is at its core. A bunch of selfish, greedy morons. But let's finally wrap all this up. Despite how incredible Case of the Golden Isle is, it's sadly a game that has flown way under the radar, with not many people having heard of it or being too interested in it compared to breakout hits like Obra Dinn. Those who have picked up the game have spoken positively about it, and quite a few outlets have nominated it as one of their Game of the Year recommendations. But in terms of wider appeal, even compared to the indie titles of the year, it's mostly been left in the dust. But that's not to say it was a failure, as it was still quite a modest success, getting a decent following, press, and likely profits for such a small game. It just feels like far less than the game this brilliant and stylistic deserves. Perhaps detective games simply aren't the most broadly appealing genre, or perhaps the art style really does just put far too many people off. But whatever reason, it's a shame it didn't take off in the same way Obra Dinn did. It's certainly not the end of the story though, as just recently, the team released their first DLC, with 3 extra cases that tell a prequel story that stands toe-to-toe with the main game. And judging from how they've titled it and their wording in their press releases, there's plenty more on the way. Hopefully these can do some work in giving it plenty of extra shots to capture new eyes and soar the way Obra Dinn once did. But no matter what, Golden Isle stands as an utterly fantastic experience that I'm not going to forget for a long time. And I recommend anyone even remotely interested pick it up. It's a bit short for some, with just about 5 to 6 hours if you take your time, for the cost of $18. But it's 5 to 6 hours easily worth the price tag, so please do give it a shot. But that's all for now. See you all in the next video, wherever that takes us.